Hi, I'm Lady Genevieve, and I have an above average amount of opinions about the golden age of Hollywood musicals and what does or does not make a good biopic. And I'm using the word biopic very loosely. When I say biopic, I'm more so referring to any movies that are aiming to tell the stories of people that really existed. They can be historical figures famous for some socio-political reason, or famous entertainers from the film, television, or music industries. There was recently a story reported by Deadline that Chris Evans would be playing Gene Kelly in a film based on an idea Chris conceived himself. As far as I'm aware, at the time of me recording this video, neither Chris Evans nor the other attached names have commented to confirm that this project is actually a thing. I've been learning more about producing in one of my courses, and it's been really interesting to learn more about the logistics of development and more of the moving parts of how a film gets made. Based on the bits I've learned thus far, if this project is something they're working on, it would still be in the earlier stages of development. I could try to play detective about when this idea came about, but ultimately, it would all be speculation, just so we're clear. He was caught saying on the record during a virtual panel in March 2021 that he was reading a Gene Kelly biography.
I'm also reading a book about Gene Kelly's life, which has been really enlightening and kind of interesting.
I can imagine that people don't know half of Gene Kelly's life.
Yeah. Well, he was, he was a tough man, but he had a very interesting upbringing. You know what I mean? He comes from meager beginnings and wasn't a dancer initially. He was a little athlete. You know what I mean? Dancing didn't kind of happen. That wasn't his main focus as a kid.
You could form a hypothesis that this is what sparked the idea for this story, and that all that time spent inside further helped him to do little else but play games and incubate ideas for new projects. But considering that he already was interested in musicals prior to this and had experienced tap dancing, it's just as plausible that this idea was already brewing long before that.
Elizabeth Olsen just revealed that you are a tap dancer.
Aw, she's out there saying that to everybody. Listen. All right. Yes, I did grow up tap dancing. I can't say I'm a tap dancer, but that's what Lizzie is putting out there.
She is. You've got a lot to live up to now.
All right, I'll take it. Why not?
Absolutely.
Makes me look cool, right?
I want to first go through a few points regarding biopics in general before we shift back over to matters pertaining to Gene Kelly, MGM, and this specific project according to what the rumor mill is claiming about it. Hollywood has a biopic problem. They love cranking out biopics more than Rihanna loves teasing her fans that she will release new music and then not releasing new music. Hollywood biopics can get very insidious in a few ways. When they do biopics that are focused on socio-political historical figures, it can potentially play into the problem of needlessly giving war criminals and fascists good PR and foster a much more inflamed sense of jingoism. When Hollywood does biopics of famous performers from show business, this is when things can start to get insufferably self-congratulatory. The incessant need for Hollywood to crank out biopics can feel less like celebrating a wonderful artist and more like a means of giving your own industry great PR. Look how great our history is of the talent we've accumulated. Stream the works of this artist so the capitalists who scam those artists with bad contracts can hoard even more wealth, like the evil dragons they are. From a creative perspective, biopics can start to become extremely monotonous, very factory line mass production when you have a set formula that you insist on copying and pasting for more or less every person you choose to make a biopic of. Show them as a child, have them get into the thing they would eventually become famous for, career highs, personal lows, and then they either die tragically young or sadly succumb to some sort of addiction. Part of the problem is that when you try to cram a person's entire life story into 2 hours, you're never going to be able to tell the full story. You can, and probably will, pick and choose whatever makes for a good dramatic narrative. Maybe you fudge judge certain historical accuracies, and depending on whose story you're telling, if you're playing fast and loose with the facts of their life or dramatizing things to make for a good movie, you run the risk of being disrespectful to the artists themselves, to their loved ones who are still alive, and to the fans who are more well-read on what is or isn't accurate to that artist's life story and want that story to do this artist justice. In addition to that, this idea of having a set formula for how to do a biopic is fundamentally antithetical to creativity and innovation. Hollywood repeatedly reinforces this idea that biopics are good, so even if a biopic isn't done well, it's still more likely to get good reviews, get nominated, or even win awards, and so on and so forth. However, I myself don't inherently dislike biopics. I'm not particularly fond of the trends I just mentioned, but there are ways to do biopics in the broader sense of what I'm classifying as biopics that can make for a great film. I will give a few examples of ones that I really liked and some reasons why. Both Diarios de Motocicletas and the Che duology were adaptations of books that honed in on the very specific parts of the life of Che Guevara. Diarios de Motocicletas is covering a trip he took with his friend Alberto Granado, traveling through numerous countries in Latin America before he became known as the famous political revolutionary. The Che duology covered two major events that were outlined in diaries the real Che wrote that were eventually published. One was the revolution to overthrow the US-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista, and then there was the Bolivia diaries that happened at the end of his life. Having a print source material can help with outlining a narrative for a film, but the broader advantage that these films have compared to the more traditional biopic format is that they're not attempting to cover the entire life story of the person the biopic is about. You don't have to rush through things nearly as much when you're only focusing on a specific chapter of a person's life. Of course, it doesn't hurt when you have amazing actors like Gael Garcia Bernal and Benicio del Toro to play the lead role, but that's not really the focus of this video, or at least this part of it. Right now, I'm more so talking about the broader concepts of what makes certain biopics work better for me as a viewer. Similar to the films I just mentioned, Judy was a film that I really enjoyed that did not try to cover the entire life story of its subject, Judy Garland, but predominantly focused on one chapter of her life, which was the final months of it when she took a job in London. Another thing that I think is worth noting is that there is a fictionalized thing added into the story where Judy is shown spending time with some of her gay fans. The reason why this was put into the movie was to symbolically show an important part of her legacy, which is that she was an ally to such an extent that went far beyond a lot of her contemporaries. She was truly ahead of her time when it came to publicly acknowledging and accepting her gay fans, so much so that it helped strengthen the expression "friend of Dorothy" as a code for queer folks to safely find each other and avoid hostility. For me, this fictional edition was a really good example of how to embellish things in a way that ultimately serves the greater purpose of telling the audience something important about the subject of the biopic. In this case, the fact that Judy Garland was an ally and a gay icon. The final biopic I want to highlight is Rocketman, which I actually had made a video about before, but Paramount manually copyright claimed it, so the video was no longer visible because I don't typically make a habit of allowing giant corporations to abuse YouTube's flawed copyright system to leech profits off of my labor when my posted video falls under fair use. Anyway, Rocketman is very unique for a couple of reasons. For one, the subject of the film, Elton John, is still alive, so he was able to be involved with the creative development of the film. Additionally, since Elton John is first and foremost famous for his music, they took a different approach when incorporating his songs into the film by not merely showing the songs as they were created and became hits in reality, but they used Elton John's songs in a way that you would see music used in a musical to convey and enhance a particular emotion in that part of the story. As a result, Rocketman straddles the line between being a traditional biopic and a straight-up Elton John musical. They also leaned into visual surrealism for these musical numbers. Even if your starting point when deciding you want to tell a story about or including a prominent figure is to envision the generic biopic formula, I feel very strongly that one of the ways you can make your biopic truly great is to find ways to deviate from that formula. Whether that is achieved by focusing in more closely on a specific chapter of that person's life, or doing a fusion with another genre, like the musical genre, that will be a great springboard to freshen up the story and overall viewing experience. This brings us to Gene Kelly, who is an absolute icon. He has given so many incredible performances, largely during the golden age of Hollywood musicals, but his life was, of course, more than just that period. He played sports when he was younger before he really decided to get serious about dancing professionally, which is part of why he has such a distinct physicality as a dancer. A lot of times the media would compare him to Fred Astaire and try to make it out to be some sort of rivalry between them because that's what entertainment outlets do. There are a fair few quotes from Gene about Fred, and regardless of whether or not some of them sound like they're a confirmation of a rivalry, Gene was very clear in saying that there was no rivalry. If we had any resentment, it was not with each other, but with the journalists who talked about two highly individual dancers as if they were one person. For instance, the sort of wardrobe I wore, blue jeans, sweatshirt, sneakers, Fred would never have been caught dead in. He was always immaculate at rehearsals, while I was always in an old shirt. Fred's steps were small, neat, graceful, and intimate, where mine were ballet-oriented and athletic. But we were never rivals. There's a refreshing level of almost self-deprecating humor to the honest way Gene speaks about himself, especially when the topic is about the comparisons people made between him and Fred. I work bigger. Fred's style is more intimate. I'm very jealous of that when I see him on the small screen. Fred looks so great on TV. I would love to put on a white tie and tails and look as thin as him and glide as smoothly, but I'm built like a blocking tackle. Gene further states, I arrived in Hollywood 20 pounds overweight and as strong as an ox, but if I put on a white tails and tux like him, I still looked like a truck driver. It's actually really sweet how much mutual respect these two had for each other as performers and the way that each of them worked.
You know that Kelly, he is terrific. That's all there is to it. I mean, I for a good many years now, I've admired this fella.
Since I keep mentioning Fred, I should probably also address the elephant in the room, which is the recent reports about a supposed Fred Astaire biopic in which Tom Holland would apparently be the one to play Fred Astaire. I am strongly opposed to this, as I would imagine any Fred Astaire fan would be, because Fred Astaire explicitly stated that he did not want any biopics made about him. He even had it put into his will. It would be spitting in the face of his legacy to go against something he made so abundantly clear. I could say more about that, but that's the short version. Now let's get back to Gene Kelly. Another thing I love about Gene is how part of what made him so distinct was this strong ideology of what type of entertainer he wanted to be in relation to the people. We've got these quotes about the comparisons between him and Fred and comments about how he would dress, but there are more quotes that further elaborate on why this would be a topic of conversation. Fred Astaire represented the aristocracy. I represented the proletariat. Gene Kelly. Now you're speaking my language. Fred Astaire first became a huge name doing musicals all the way back during classic Hollywood cinema. He was co-starring with Ginger Rogers in some of the biggest musicals of the 1930s. These were in black and white. Gene Kelly, on the other hand, didn't really start to become famous until the mid-1940s, so when you go through a highlight reel of Gene Kelly's most famous works as a performer, you get that glorious Technicolor. This brings us to another quote from Gene Kelly that better explains the larger cultural factors that influenced how these two iconic performers developed in very different ways. In the 1930s, there was this tendency in Hollywood to portray everyone as rich. Even if they were doing a poor man's dance, they were also also nicely clothed, gowned, coiffured. That's why I decided to wear white socks, loafers, t-shirts, and blue jeans. I had a socio-political context in front of me. I was a child of the Depression who danced in a way that would represent the common man. As if I didn't have enough reasons to love Gene Kelly. Another quote from him in a similar vein to this sentiment is, "I didn't want to move or act like a rich man. I wanted to dance in a pair of jeans. I wanted to dance like the man in the streets." Now, I'm not sharing these quotes just because I want to remind everyone that Gene Kelly is an anti-bourgeoisie icon. I'm also bringing it up because it's a fascinating detail when you remember that these iconic musicals we think of when we think of Gene Kelly were done by MGM. More specifically, Louis B. Mayer's MGM. If you are new here, I've already stated before on my channel that I am not a fan of Louis B. Mayer. I talked about this in my video essay, The Cultural and Storytelling Parallels of Some Like It Hot and White Chicks. Louis B. Mayer made the Oscars because he wanted to stop the formation of unions in Hollywood. He was also a creep with multiple claims made against him of sexual abuse, Judy Garland being one of them. Gene Kelly was quoted in a segment of That's Entertainment 3, Behind the Screen, which was a program from 1994. When other MGM stars were praising Louis B. Mayer, Gene Kelly said, "I didn't like him. He didn't like me. It was mutual." Tell us how you really feel, Gene. Truly, I am not done with this Gene Kelly section because I need to keep reminding everyone of how iconic Gene is. But also, another reason why attempting to do any biopic projects about him is complicated. Louis B. Mayer was a scumbag and a creep, as was Arthur Freed. If you don't know who that is, Arthur Freed was a producer and a lyricist, and he worked on a lot of Gene Kelly's famous, beloved musicals. But he was also accused of things. One example being Shirley Temple when she was underage. She came in for a meeting and he did something he should not have done. You can look it up if you want to, but fair warning, it's gross. Gene Kelly was awesome, but the fact that these horrific creeps were in his orbit when making these incredible, beloved works of art means that if anyone were to try to do a more traditional biopic about Gene during that time period in particular, you would have to really take the time to figure out if and how you would want those other figures to be presented in the story. I do, however, think that there is room to do a different project, probably in a limited series, that would explore Gene Kelly's proletariat ideology. Remember, he also opposed the HUAC. That's hot. And how this ideology clashed with the horrifically exploitative capitalist model of Hollywood during this time period. Gene had to work during the old Hollywood system where stars would be contracted to one studio, and that studio would control everything. He even missed out on doing the Guys and Dolls movie because MGM refused to loan him out for the production, even though later on down the line, MGM ended up being the one to distribute the film. And Gene was furious about not getting to do that film. He never forgave them for it. He later said about this incident, "I was born to play Sky Masterson like Clark Gable was born to play Rhett Butler. I love my salty legend, Gene Kelly." You know who ended up playing Sky Masterson? Marlon Brando. Listen, Brando can do certain things very well, but you are delusional if you think he was a better choice for that part than Gene Kelly. Gene Kelly further said about that period of working under MGM and that old Hollywood system, "The contract system at Hollywood studios like MGM was a very efficient system in that because we were at the studio all the time, we could rehearse a lot. But it also really repressed people. There were no union regulations yet, and we were all indentured servants. You can call us slaves if you want. Like ball players before free agency. We had 7-year contracts, but every 6 months, the studio could decide to fire you if your picture wasn't a hit. And if you turned down a role, they cut off your salary and simply added the time to your contract." When you think about how challenging it is to make a movie, and then you factor in the unhinged, working conditions of this era of Hollywood, the fact that Gene Kelly was able to accomplish as much as he did creatively, I don't know how else to describe it other than miraculous. If this period of Gene Kelly's career wasn't densely layered enough as is, Gene was also a director, and I love how in tune he was with what certain filmmakers get wrong about how they present the art of dance on screen. In film, a dancer should always be shot from head to toe, because that way you can see the whole body, and that is the art of dancing. Nowadays, they shoot the nose, left nostril, right nostril, hand, foot, bust, derrière. The film prevents you from determining who is a good dancer and who is not. If you've seen my review of Steven Spielberg's West Side Story, you will know why this quote would speak to me on a spiritual level. Also, let me just share one more shady quote from Gene because he's just so funny and unapologetic, and I love him for it. There's nothing revolutionary about Saturday Night Fever. You can see the same kind of movement at your local disco. We have to laugh. This is when we can start to shift to talking more about Chris Evans potentially portraying Gene Kelly and the premise that's been listed online. The Deadline article states, the film is about a 12-year-old boy who works on the MGM lot in 1952 and begins to create an imagined friendship with the legendary movie star Kelly while working on his next film. When I first read that, my reflex was to go, oh, are we calling out child labor? Is he a laborer working in the crew? But then I realized that it's far more likely that it would be about a child actor. I still say there's room to call out Hollywood from that other angle that I mentioned, but I digress. If I were to guess, based on how Chris Evans presents himself, I'm not claiming to have that level of insight into his creative process, I don't know him, and I'm working to remove myself from as many parasocial relationships as I can, I would guess that the story is coming from Chris's personal experience of growing up, being creatively inspired by Gene Kelly's brilliance as a performer. If you've ever watched a Gene Kelly musical, you will know how ridiculously charismatic he was and how brilliant he was as a dancer. Being that Chris Evans has studied tap dancing, I would easily assume he would have grown up watching some Gene Kelly films at some point. I can relate. There are a couple of reasons why this premise, to me, seems like a good idea. As I previously explained, trying to cram the events of a person's entire lifetime into a 2-hour runtime can very easily go wrong. This premise is focusing in on something far more specific. It's also not really a biopic. It's more so about Gene Kelly as this mythological figure and icon that has entertained millions and millions of people for several decades. There's a difference between the many people that have watched Gene Kelly movies versus the people who have done deeper research into the man behind Technicolor. Regardless of this premise being one that can potentially allow for more creative liberties with how you present Gene Kelly in this story, because he would be the idea of Gene Kelly in the mind of a young Gene Kelly fan, as opposed to the actual Gene Kelly, research is still an incredibly important part of the development process, especially when you are doing a project involving real people who are a part of history. Benicio del Toro said that he researched Che Guevara for something like 7 years before he and Steven Soderbergh made the Che duology. Gael Garcia Bernal went to Cuba to meet Che's family and to meet the real Alberto Granado, who was still alive at the time. Gael also read a bunch of Che's biographies and just did loads of other research. Even if you're only playing into the mythos of Gene Kelly, I would hope that there would still be historical Easter egg references that speak to greater details of Gene's life and his career. I know there has been a bit of a back and forth between Gene Kelly stans and Chris Evans stans on the Bird app. That was certainly not a fandom conflict I would have been able to predict going into 2022. I'm of the belief that Chris Evans and the project, as it's been described in this article, has more potential than some of the Gene Kelly stans might think, but I'm also of the belief that Chris and other members of the creative team have a lot of work they need to do in order to make this project really shine the way I want it to. To start things off, for those who aren't as familiar with the creative background of Chris Evans, the signs were already there that he wanted to do a musical. He did local theater before he got started in Hollywood, and he liked and still likes musicals. He's taken tap lessons before, so he's not starting at a baseline of zero going into a project like this. I know there was some chatter last year about a Little Shop of Horrors movie. At this point, I think it's fairly safe to say that it's been taken off the table.
Little Shop, you know, it hit the brakes for a minute. Just it had some budget issues. You know, when COVID hit, all of a sudden these budgets for films go through the roof, trying to make it a safe place to go to work. So, you know, the discussions stalled a bit to a point that I was calling my team saying, "Hey, what's going on with Little Shop? What's going on with Little Shop? Who do I have to talk to? What do I have to do?" I actually just emailed Berlanti, the director, a few weeks ago, just saying, "Hey man, I haven't heard anything. What's going on?" And then he just said, "You know, it's just a little back and forth right now with Warner Brothers. I think a lot of things are up in the air, and we are living in such a rapidly changing time. So you may try and budget out a movie right now with certain COVID requirements that might change in a couple months. So for now, I think it's a little bit at a standstill."
I don't care to get into many details about that project, but one thing that I think is important to note is that the development process to make a film happen is very long. It's a lot of work. I've been learning more about it, and yeah, the TLDR of it is that it's incredible that any movie ever gets made. That's why the only articles being written about this project are rumors. I don't know who's leaking this information to the trades, but when you're the one putting in the hours of labor into trying to put together pitches and secure funding and hire the right people to work on the project so that it can be successful, there is no way you would announce any of that to the masses until things are much further along in the development process. Even then, things can still go wrong and the project could just disappear. One of the key parts of developing a successful project of any kind, not just biopics, is to get the right people to work with you. Filmmaking is a collaborative effort, and having the wrong people working on a project can lead to disaster. Just ask the people who had to work on Bohemian Rhapsody. The Deadline article claimed that Rian Johnson and Ram Bergman would be co-producing the film. Those two have been working together since Ryan's first feature film, Brick. Obviously, Chris already knows Ryan, and presumably by extension Ram as well, from working together on Knives Out.
Yeah, listen, hey, Ryan, will you hire me again?
Are you kidding me, man? Let's do a musical.
Hey, don't tempt me!
Clearly, they have a good rapport, which bodes well for a more harmonious work environment. That's one of the reasons why Benicio got Steven Soderbergh to direct Che. They had already worked together on Traffic. It doesn't do you much good to get professionally involved with people you cannot stand. Getting a film made is hard work, particularly when you're starting from the very beginning process of development. It's very different to being an actor auditioning for something that's already up and running, or even just outright offered the part if you're established or connected enough to be able to just be offered gigs. Must be nice. I know the stands have been giddy over the way that social media clip has seemingly come full circle about the two of them saying they should do a musical. But what I want to talk about now is the other co-producer named in this article who is also supposed to write the screenplay, John Logan. If you don't know who John Logan is, buckle up because he has worked with legends. He did screenplays for 2 Ridley Scott films, Gladiator and Alien Covenant. If you've been following me on Twitter, you know I'm going through a bit of a Ridley Scott awakening. House of Gucci was my favorite film of 2021, so naturally I'm bound to get extra excited from seeing that John Logan has worked with him. He also did the screenplay for Any Given Sunday. That's an Oliver Stone film. Oliver Stone is a badass. But there are a few other writing credits that stood out to me as they pertain to this Chris Evans Gene Kelly project. He did the screenplay for Tim Burton's Sweeney Todd movie, meaning he's not completely unfamiliar as a writer with the movie musical world. But even more importantly, he did the screenplay for 2 Martin Scorsese films. The Aviator and Hugo. Just for the record, Hugo is the most underrated Scorsese film. Argue with the wall. Beyond these films being a big deal because Martin Scorsese is a big deal, both of these films were drawing on film history. In Hugo, you have Georges Méliès, a pioneer of the entire filmmaking medium. And in The Aviator, you have Howard Hughes, who was a legendary filmmaker that released most of his films from the 1930s to the 1950s. Both of those Scorsese films were really good at balancing telling history, showing love to what these artists created and accomplished, and having a compelling narrative through it all. Suffice it to say, John Logan is a really good fit for a project like this. In particular, though, I got extremely excited when I looked him up and saw The Aviator on his list of credits. And this is where we get into what I think needs to happen for this film to truly excel. That's right, I am offering unsolicited opinions about technical things. You're welcome. The reason why I got so excited about The Aviator being listed on screenwriter John Logan's credits is because Martin Scorsese decided to have that film color graded to recreate the look of Technicolor. If you've watched my West Side Story videos, of which there are several, you know how I feel about Technicolor. It's an absolute must. But the thing about Technicolor is that the equipment to film on Technicolor does not exist anymore. The camera companies no longer manufacture that equipment. Technicolor is an essential ingredient for why the films from the golden age of Hollywood musicals look as incredible as they do. On The Aviator, this recreation of Technicolor was a collaborative process between a lot of people, including, but not limited to, the cinematographer, Robert Richardson, the visual effects supervisor, Rob Legato, the Technicolor Digital Intermediate Senior Colorist, Steven Nakamura. I keep saying film is a collaborative process, and this is further evidence of that. I feel very strongly that this Chris Evans, Gene Kelly film needs to look like it was shot on Technicolor. At the bare minimum, any musical numbers need to have that Technicolor look. I will have an attitude if the look is not right. Another thing that needs to happen is you have to find the right director for a project like this. More specifically, you need to hire a director that knows how to direct dance numbers. Remember that quote I shared earlier in this video where Gene Kelly was being nitpicky about how film as a medium can ruin the art of dance, and you need to show dancers in their entirety when they're dancing? Yeah. That. I don't want to derail this video by reiterating my issues with Steven Spielberg's West Side Story, but I have to say it. If you are going to do a big dance number, wide shots and long takes. Do not overly edit a dance number with a million cuts from one angle to another angle in such a way that you are incessantly disrupting the view of the dancers and the choreography. I felt really foolish for being as excited as I was about a new West Side Story with a director as brilliant as Steven Spielberg, only for the opening number and the Mambo number and even the America number to miss the mark for how to properly showcase dancers and choreography. Do not hire a director for any type of Gene Kelly project just because that director has a big name. They need to be qualified to direct this specific type of material. I will throw a name out there, not because I need it to be this specific person, but it's just a good example of what being qualified looks like. John M. Chu. Rewatch Step Up to the Streets. That final dance number with the rain, life-changing. I say that with zero hyperbole. He has a lot of knowledge and experience in the world of dance, and that's why the musical numbers in the Heights look as fantastic as they do. Remember that big dance number out in the streets? Remember how wide the shots were? Wide shots. Long takes. So help me if you make me sit through another musical number with choppy editing where I cannot see the full choreography, I will develop a stomach ulcer. Now, depending on if this project happens and when, John M. Chu might be too busy working on other projects like the Wicked movie. That's why I'm saying I don't need it to be John M. Chu. I just need someone who understands the assignment like John M. Chu does. And I feel like I should note, in case you're watching this video and have not heard any of my several long-winded opinions about West Side Story, I don't dislike Steven Spielberg. He's a genius. I just didn't like the way those dance numbers were put together.
That's so upsetting.
The final thing that I need to happen involves Chris Evans himself as someone who may or may not be taking on the Herculean task of portraying Gene Kelly. I know a lot has been said, especially by Gene Kelly stans, to question whether Chris is the right person to play Gene, so let's unpack this a little bit. The idea of Chris Evans playing Gene Kelly intrigues me. Like I said before, much earlier on in this video, Gene Kelly had a very unique physicality as a dancer because he was a skilled sportsman before he got back into rigorously training as a dancer and pursuing that professionally. Chris Evans has an interesting inversion of that concept because when he's done these different gigs where he has to perform Hollywood action, he has brought a unique physicality that is intertwined with him having some amount of experience in dance. There's a quote from Joe Johnston, the director of the first Captain America film, that talked about this. He's very fast, and he also has a very unique run. I mean, it's almost a dancer's run. And when we tried to double him for running, there was nobody who could run like him. They just didn't have the same dynamics or the way he moves, and he had to end up doing most of his own running. That quote is from the commentary track of the film. I got help verifying the source from the Chris Evans fan page, Everything Evans. Feel free to follow them on the Bird app if you want to up your quota of Chris Evans content on your feed. The merging of a dancer's athleticism with more traditional sports athleticism or stunt athleticism is very unique. I'm not saying Chris Evans can just show up tomorrow and tap dance anywhere near the level of Gene Kelly, but I think that there is potential. There's a cycle Chris has gone through for multiple films now of learning things like fight choreography. I think there was a bit of wire work and push, but I don't remember. I'm trying to put that film out of my mind.
Yo, it's not funny. It's really not funny.
He also had to learn how to do some skateboarding for Scott Pilgrim.
Had you skateboarded a lot before you came?
This will be my 4th day on a skateboard.
All things considered, I think he picked that up pretty well for a skateboarding novice. I didn't actually know about the skateboarding training, by the way, until my mod, Emily, brought it to my attention, so thank you, Emily, for helping me out with an extra trivia detail. The principle here is that if you already have certain skills and knowledge, you will be able to better accumulate more of those skills and knowledge. For example, if you're already bilingual, it's much easier to learn a third language than it is the second language. The more languages you know, the easier it becomes to learn a new one. If you know how to play some musical instruments, it becomes much easier to learn how to play even more musical instruments. And for Chris Evans, he is someone that already has a fair bit of knowledge, skills, and experience with learning new, difficult physical movements to perform. I think he's in a good position to build on his prior experience with tap dancing and his experience rigorously training to get to a much higher level in order to play Gene Kelly. And make no mistake, he needs to train very, very rigorously. That's what this whole tangent has been building to. I need Chris Evans to Charlie's Angels it. What does that mean? If you've been around on my channel, you know I love the Charlie's Angels films from the early 2000s. I did this whole massive deep dive into Charlie's Angels 2000, and those women trained for 8 hours a day, 5 or 6 days a week, for 3 months so that they could do a lot of their fight choreography and stunts themselves. If you are not throwing yourself into the thing at that level, I don't want it. Get it away from me.
And that means the basic strength training, flexibility training, and then the wire training.
God, I love them. I should really do a video on the sequel at some point. Anyway, you didn't come here for a full throttle tangent. My point is, if Chris Evans really wants to play Gene Kelly, and I've given him the benefit of the doubt despite being a massive Gene Kelly fan, I'm not completely writing off the possibility of Chris Evans being able to do a decent job playing this reimagined, fantastical version of Gene Kelly. But if you're going to do that, you need to Charlie's Angels that thing. Months of rigorous training before you even set foot in front of a single camera to begin filming. Lucy Liu, My Girl Drew, and Cameron D are the standard. They are the blueprint, so get to it. Oh, and one last little detail. Gene Kelly does this one move that as a child I likened to an airplane because he would spin in a way that to my childhood brain looked like an airplane propeller. You need to do that move. And by do that move, if you could do it, I don't know, 3 or 4 times at least, that would be much appreciated. Those are my long, unsolicited opinions about a Chris Evans, Gene Kelly film that might not even happen. It's far too early in the development process for any of us to know for sure. But even if this project doesn't happen, it gave me an excuse to hype up Gene Kelly here on my channel, so I am not mad either way. What's your favorite Gene Kelly performance? Let me know in the comments. I will accept Xanadu as an answer, by the way, not because I think that it's the best Gene Kelly performance, but it would amuse me if someone unironically gave Xanadu a shout out. If you've made it all the way to the end, put a donut emoji in the comments because it is not a donut hole at all, but a smaller donut with its own hole. And our donut is not whole at all. See you in the next one. Bye.